Thanks so much. It's really a delight and a novelty for us to be here. This is our first time at UC Merced. It's also the first time, for me, not for Nick, that we've presented this work. So we published the work, but I haven't had the chance to present it. I brought Nick along, keep me in line, and also to help really provide the environmental context for this work. Because if it were not for Nick, our lab would not be looking at environmental decision making, which now turns out to be a great decision on Nick's part. So thank you, Nick. So just by way of background, I'll provide some background, and then we'll talk about the main findings in the paper, and then we'll finally try to talk about some implications. And so Nick is going to head off the proceedings with some of the background, just sort of motivating the environmental question, and he's also going to wrap things up with the implications and probably interject. And you guys should interject too. If you have questions, please ask them in the middle. We're happy to try to field them, or delay them to the end if they're really deep and conceptual. Either way. So Nick.
Alrighty. Hi everybody. I'm Nik Sawe. I'm at the Emma Interdisciplinary Program in Environmental Resources at Stanford, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about basically the neuroeconomics behind environmental decision making, and in particular environmental philanthropy and how we value the environment. So this all got motivated by a while ago I was working in the biotech field, and I was reading neuroeconomics papers for fun, as we all do, I'm sure. And I started noticing they're talking about how we allocate scarce resources, how we make trade-offs between short-term benefits and long-term gains, or between moral and economic values. These are all things that are very relevant to the environmental issues that we face today and how we think about them. So I started looking around, and no one really was working in this area. So we're going to be talking about one of the studies around this today, and then hopefully if we have a little time in Q&A, I can also fill you guys in on a new study about energy efficiency decisions for folks. So I want you to think for a minute about how this landscape makes you feel, since we're a stone's throw away from Yosemite here. And now I want you to think, how much do you value that landscape still being around in the coming years for you to visit and for your kids to visit, that sort of thing. Now, how many of you actually had a dollar value assigned to that fund, right? Very, very few, but I think what ends up happening is environmental economists do want to actually attach a dollar value to this, figure out how much the environment is worth to us for purposes like litigation or development, most notably in the case of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. They're using these contingent valuation surveys and basically asking people, hypothetical way, how much they'd be willing to pay for natural resources or for ecosystem services to be protected or restored. They ran into quite a few problems with this. One is incentive compatibility. Everything was hypothetical, so people didn't actually have to pay what they were being asked to pay. Another big thing was the presence of protest zeros. So you had a lot of people saying, you can't put a price on this, it's invaluable, right? And they would opt out of giving a hard number. And what this ended up doing was, in a lot of these surveys, a third to half of the respondents are lost, and they're thrown out. They're not evaluated at all. And so, if you can imagine, this might be pushing down people's willingness to pay for the environment to lower than it actually is, because you're taking people who value it the most and extracting them from that sample. And then another thing that environmental economists were kind of worried about was, were people focusing, instead of valuing the resource, were they focusing on what was happening to the place and the destructive actions of a third party and how they felt about that? Maybe that was actually determining what people were willing to pay. And so it would be getting at something that the environmental economists didn't actually aim to test. Right. This is a very, the parks, even though we had some hypothetical questions in the study design when we were asking people to donate to protect parks, it's very real world. When we started the study, over a quarter of the California state parks were scheduled for closure. Thankfully, they found more money in the budget to keep them open. I think this comes up again in a year or two. They're going to be under the gun again. So while they were at risk, a lot of people were experimenting with, should we privatize these parks? Should we sell off parts of the land, or let people use the land for new services, that sort of thing, have corporate sponsorship. So really ties into how people value these natural resources. So we can get at this, how people value natural resources, through a variety of surveys and looking at people's behavior, their choices. And we really want to look at how valuation influences behavior. And so I'm going to let Brian acquaint you with how we do that from Neuro Economics perspective, and yeah, talk about the experimental design.
So our basic questions in this first very pilot research were derived from what we had done before in Neuro Economics. So I'll talk a bit about that to give you a background. And based on that work, I wouldn't say we have a theory, but we have at least a model of targets in the brain and that we can use to try to make inferences about how people value things, quite diverse things actually. But our basic questions were these: how do people value the environment? So as Nick mentioned, there are many different ways to try to assess this. If you administer these different methods, they don't always agree. So for instance, from the psychology field or maybe public policy, you might administer surveys. Nick mentioned the problems with protest zeros in these surveys, people saying I wouldn't be able to place a price on these resources. There's also something called scope insensitivity, which has to do with people having a hard time putting a dollar value on losing, say, 10 seagulls versus 10,000 seagulls. There are other strange effects, like focusing on the threat that Nick mentioned, so instead of the resource. And if I were an economist, I might use a very different type of assessment, and it might have to do more with asking people for a value, an elicited value of that resource, or just to make choices about whether they would spend money, for instance, to travel to the resource. But additional biases can also occur in these kinds of assessments. And if you use these different methods of assessing value, they're not necessarily going to produce the same results. And sometimes they'll produce quite variable results. So we thought we'd complexify things further by measuring brain activation as people were valuing things. But in the end, what we'd like is to sort of have a way of triangulating with these methods to get some assessment of environmental value. This may seem like a strange question. How does valuation influence behavior? Because in many fields, including psychology and economics, certain people would assess valuation as a function of choice. So valuation would be synonymous with behavior. But as I'll try to argue later in this talk, we actually think of valuation as a process, a set of processes that then combine to drive choice. And we think that actually brain activation or neuroimaging can be a useful tool, and trying to, as well as other tools that are more conventionally psychological, to try to get a handle on what these processes are, how they're combining, and how they're driving choice. So I'll start with some background on neuroeconomics. We have a certain approach in my laboratory, and also many other laboratories are adopting this sort of an approach, which has evolved over the last 15 years. So during the time when people were first using neuroimaging to look at brain activity, they were mainly thinking about correlated activity. So they would do an experiment where they would manipulate some input, and they would see some correlation in brain activity, and that would sort of be the report. Okay, there's some brain activity correlated with condition A versus B. But what we're also interested in is predictive activity, and by that I mean, if you're measuring a choice, is there brain activity that actually predicts the choice that somebody is about to make? And also we're interested in the overlap, and we think in this overlap is where interesting decision processes and choice processes related to and that drive choice occur. And so my laboratory has also been focused on a rather odd niche of psychology having to do with how people feel, or what we call affect. So we've been asking two basic questions since about 2001. That is, which brain mechanisms anticipate good and bad events? So that could be thought of as correlated activity. And does their activity actually influence choice? So you can imagine people having an emotional response to something, correlated brain activity, but that really not being consequential for their next decision. So we're sort of interested in both of these questions and the intersection between them. And you'll see that in the analyses that I'll describe. when we started this work, there was quite a body of animal literature, animal research in neuroscience that suggested that there are brain circuits that unconditionally can elicit sort of motivated behavior, motivated approach, or motivated avoidance. This is an old photograph from the laboratory of James Olds from 1952. And it shows a rat that's working very hard to press this bar. What might be hard to make out is there's a wire actually going into his head. And that wire is hooked up to the bar. And so this rat is working very hard to stimulate its own brain. Now, not every location in the brain can elicit this kind of self-stimulation behavior, but once it's elicited, it's quite powerful. And the rat will essentially do this to the exclusion of many other activities, including eating, drinking, having sex, sleeping, and so forth, until it's sort of exhausted. There are also other loci in the brain that will elicit the opposite sort of behavior, where the rat will work very hard to turn off the stimulation. And most of these foci are interesting in terms of where they are in the brain. So many of the ones that elicit self-stimulation lie along the ascending trajectory of a specific neurotransmitter system, the dopamine, ascending mesolimbic dopamine system, that projects to subcortical foci and also to cortical foci, so quite broadly. And these subcortical foci tend to powerfully elicit this kind of behavior. So based on this research, if you believe that animals, or at least rats, mammals have sort of commonalities in their neural circuitry, you might think that where you would want to look to predict motivated behavior would be in these deep subcortical nuclei. And in fact, people did think that, but they couldn't look deep in the brain until about 1992, when fMRI came on the scene. This is just, I'll skip to this slide. And functional magnetic resonance imaging sort of had a combination of features that made it useful for seeing second-to-second changes in activity meaning oxygenation, in these deep subcortical nuclei that were on the order of millimeters. And so it sort of hit the sweet spot in terms of resolution that potentially could allow you to see activity, transient activity in these circuits. Another development in animal literature was that a researcher named Wolfram Schultz and some other researchers actually measured the activity of these dopamine neurons in monkeys as they were presented with rewards and anticipated rewards. And what he found was that the activity in these neurons fired when a reward was unexpected, but as soon as the monkeys started learning that a cue signaled the reward was coming, their firing moved to the cue, suggesting that they weren't so much signaling reward as the anticipation or prediction of reward. Now this doesn't answer, actually, how the motivation is manifested in the brain, because these, as I mentioned, neurons project to lots of other brain regions. But they give us a clue about where we should be looking in the brain as animals, and maybe humans, anticipate rewards and punishments. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of research from 2000 to 2005. But the bottom line in that research is we used very simple games, our lab and other labs, to try to elicit anticipation of reward and punishment, and also neural responses to reward and punishment outcomes. And we were faced with two challenges. One was getting into the brain to see deep activity. It's automating. It wants me to go faster. One was seeing deep in the brain. That was what we thought we could address with fMRI. The second problem was how do we motivate people with sort of comparable rewards and punishments. And it turns out that money turned out to be a very useful tool for this. That is hard to use in animals, but motivates people. So what we discovered was that not only are these deep circuits activated by rewards and punishments that are primary, like something that tastes sweet or something that tastes salty, but also by secondary or abstract rewards and punishments like money. And furthermore, what we found is that merely anticipating an uncertain reward or an uncertain punishment could activate these circuits almost as powerfully or more powerfully than actually receiving the reward and punishment itself. So this suggested to us that not only that we could send things into the brain and look at the correlated activity, but that we might be able to get back out by asking the question, okay, does activity in these circuits actually allow us to predict choice? And so I'm showing you this task not because the talk is about shopping, but it has a sort of a parallel structure to the task we'll discuss. We started looking at whether brain activity could predict choice in several different scenarios, investment, gambling, also shopping. So this is sort of a typical scenario where you might go to Amazon and see something and see the price and then decide, yes, I want to buy that, or no, I don't want to buy it. And so we had people in this experiment as they were being scanned with fMRI, encountered 80 products at 80 discounted prices, and then they decided for each of those products, did they want to buy the product or not. So we actually gave them $40 to put in their back pocket before they went into the magnet. And we told them, and this was true, that 2 of the 80 products that they decided would count for real at the end of the scan, and they would be randomly determined. And that was also true. So they were really kind of shopping in the magnet. And what we were interested in was what was happening in their brain when they were viewing things that they liked, products that they found attractive, and also prices that they found excessive. The way we were able to assess this is by asking them after the scan, how much do you want each of these products? And how much would you be willing to pay for each of these products? By asking the second question, we could actually subtract out the price from the willingness to pay. And get an assessment of whether they thought the price was excessive or not. So economists would call this consumer surplus. We called it bargain versus, I can't even remember what we called it. What do we call it? I'll think of it. Yeah, it's more colloquial. Bargain versus ripoff, that's what we called it. But that gives you a sense of what this quantity is. So we could do the conventional analysis. We could model the attractiveness of each product when people saw it, and also the excessiveness of the price when they saw the price. And then ask the question, does brain activity that's occurring here and here actually allow us to predict whether they'll eventually buy the product or not? And I guess I wouldn't be telling you this if it didn't work, but this is an example experiment. So you're in the magnet, you see this for 4 seconds, you see that for 4 seconds, and you see this, and it's counterbalanced left, right, and you choose whether you want to buy it or not. And then you go on to the next product. So when you do the conventional analysis, you do see neural activity that is associated with seeing products that you want, or that anybody wants. In this area that receives dopamine projections from the ventral tegmental area, the ones I alluded to before, including the nucleus accumbens and the caudate. Here's our volume of interest. And you see a different pattern of activity when people encounter prices that they think are excessive. So you actually see, when people think that prices are a bargain, you see an increase in prefrontal activity. That's sort of behind my finger. And you also see a decrease in anterior insula activity. And you can actually plot activity in these regions, these volumes of interest, out over time, as people are seeing the product and the price and then deciding. And you can ask the question, does the activity diverge as a function of whether people are fated to say, yes, I want to buy that product, or no, I don't want to buy the product? And what we see is that in this area, in this region, in the nucleus accumbens, when people see products that they find attractive, we see a bump up in activity. So this is before they see the price, before they've made their choice. And it continues until they've actually made their choice. So this is the period when they're seeing the product. And if they're not going to buy it, you see a decrease in activity. That suggests that we might be able to use activity in this region to predict what people will do. You see a similar but different pattern of activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. Now this white bar represents not when they saw the product, but when they saw the price. And what you see when they see prices of products they're eventually going to buy, a ramp up in activity. And when they see prices of products they're not going to buy, you see a dip in activity. However, you see the opposite pattern in the anterior insula, such that in this region, when people see prices of products they want to buy, the activity stays low. And if they see prices of products they don't want to buy, the activity bumps up. So it's not like the whole brain is activating to things that you like, but different circuits seem to be doing different things. Now, based on these sort of patterns of activity, we can actually extract activity during these critical periods in the task and ask whether they predicted purchasing. And you can also do this sort of more standard psychological analysis. So did their ratings of how much they wanted the product and how much of a bargain versus ripoff they thought the product was, did that predict choice? It did, or post-dict, I should say, because it was after the scan. You can ask the same question about brain activity. So just including the brain activity, did that predict choice? And it turns out that regardless of who you are, what you saw, your nucleus accumbens activity when you saw the product, that's the first region I showed, positively predicts you're going to buy. Your medial prefrontal activity when you see the price also positively predicts you're going to buy, but your insula activity when you see the price negatively predicts you're going to buy. And then you can finally, this wasn't our main goal, but, and in fact these things are sort of correlated, as you might have surmised from the maps that I showed you. But you can also ask the question, if I put these two variables together in the analysis, does the self-report variable, do those wipe out the brain activation? And the answer is no. They knock it down, but the brain activation still seems to survive and provide some information about whether people are going to buy the product or not. And so this was just a sort of an existence proof, if you will, that we could use the brain activity during the fMRI scanning to actually predict whether people would purchase a product or not. And now many groups have done this under different circumstances. In fact, they've even passively shown people products and then asked them after the scan, do you want to buy this or not? And you can still use the brain activity to predict if people are going to buy something or not. So it's not just a function of making the choice in the back end. You can also analyze the data in different ways. So we have statisticians across the road that are very helpful. And they have some nice multivariate classifiers that we can throw at the data, the entire brain data actually, because we were just looking at very restrictive brain data and volumes of interest at specific time points. But you can ask over the entire brain, using some penalties for sparseness and clustering, are there features that emerge that actually classify whether people are going to buy or not? And what we see is, reassuringly actually, this nucleus accumbens caudate area, those features are predicting that you're going to buy it when the product is presented. But when the price is presented, you see this emergence of features in the medial prefrontal cortex that robustly predicts you're going to buy, and some dorsal movement of these features. And another area, the posterior cingulate, that we weren't looking at, but that suggests we could improve our model, also classifies people going to buy or not. Perhaps most interestingly, by the time people are making their choice, most of the activity is not classifying. So that suggests to us that if you want to optimally use the brain data to predict choice, you really should have a temporally resolved model, or else if you average all the activation, then you're going to miss features that will predict choice. But that's not the focus of this talk, although we can use these methods for looking at environmental questions. Now, I might have mentioned to you that our laboratory is focused on emotion. We think people feel emotion not only in response to outcomes, but also during anticipation of significant outcomes. Two affective states, that means involving valence and arousal, that we focused on are what I call positive arousal and negative arousal. These are independent states, not opposite states. And the reason that we think they're interesting is because not only do we think they might align with neurophysiology, but we think that positive arousal promotes, in a sort of an evolutionarily adaptive way, approach behavior, whereas negative arousal promotes avoidance behavior. You might wonder why they're orthogonal. That's just because of psychometric studies over the last 100 years of mood mapping out this space. But it also makes evolutionary sense. If you're in a risky situation, you might want to be ready to approach, but also to avoid at a moment's notice. So you may want to have more than one system that can subserve these behavioral tendencies. But based on these ideas, and based on our brain activation patterns, we now think we have some targets. So we think that there might be, using fMRI, signals that are associated, like in the nucleus accumbens, with anticipating good things and maybe a tendency to approach. Other signals, such as the anterior insular signal, might be more associated with anticipating bad things and a tendency to avoid. And then still other signals, like the ones in the medial prefrontal cortex, not depicted here, but in that part of the brain, might be associated with sort of balancing costs and benefits and doing some sort of assessment to integrate the two. So that's my very brief survey of neuroeconomics. Now, how is it related to the findings that we're going to discuss today? So when Nick and I began putting together this paradigm, we sought to sort of benefit from the design experience that we'd had using the shopping experiments and others. So we set up our experiment in that manner, but also to answer these questions. Does affect influence environmental valuation, like it does other types of value types of judgments? And our intuition was that people would feel positively towards what we call iconic places. Iconic means easily recognizable places. And the opposite of iconic would be sort of a state park that no one's seen before and maybe doesn't visit. So it could be correlated with your likelihood of visiting the place, but it's not the same. Actually, we took familiarity measurements, and those could not account for our iconic ratings. So iconic ratings might also apply to a place that you recognize but have never been, like Mount Rushmore or something like that. Similarly, we thought people would have negative affective reactions towards proposed uses, particularly when those uses are destructive of the environmental resource. And we believed reports from economists and others that people may be influenced by, not just by the resource that they're considering, but also the use. And our question was, could we use the brain activity associated with presentation of these aspects of a proposition to predict people's choice in acting to protect the environmental resource. So this is sort of a layout of a trial in this experiment. The framing was sort of temporally relevant to what was happening at that period in time. State parks were threatened by a shutdown. Imagine that each of the state parks may face 25% privatization. You can donate from your $20 endowment to block the use. And you have to assume that everybody else will donate a similar amount, so that is a bit of a change. Or it's something that we had to assume, but we told people, please assume that others will donate in a similar way. We varied three things about the stimuli. About the place, we varied whether they were iconic or not. About the use, we varied whether it was destructive or not. I'll show you an example. And about the price, we were able to vary the asking price that we asked them to donate. And finally, they saw yes or no prompts. And I could say, yes or no, I want to donate to offset that privatization. So if you were in the magnet, you might see something like this. It's actually a stimulus we used. And then you would see something like that. So this is a proposed use for the place. And then you would see this question: do you want to donate $3 or not out of your $20? And you can indicate yes or no. If it was me, I'd probably say yes, but you may say no. And that was done for a number of different place use combinations, 36, I think. Is that right?
Oh, 24.
Okay. Well, I guess behavioral experiment too. So we did this behaviorally, and then we did it in the magnet. Behaviorally, we could actually test whether our affective hypotheses were holding. And in the magnet, we could look for the brain activation. So we had 32 subjects in the behavioral task and 20 subjects in the neuroimaging task. And I'll just get straight to the behavioral results. So what we found, to make a long story short, is when people did this task behaviorally, we found that indeed destructiveness of the use influenced the likelihood of donating, particularly for iconic places. So this is iconic in a destructive use, iconic non-destructive use. Iconic in a non-destructive use. This is non-iconic destructive and non-iconic non-destructive. We also found changes in affect. So this is negative arousal. So again, this is a rating that we took of how positive versus negative and aroused versus not aroused people felt when they were regarding each proposition. And we found basically a similar pattern of negative arousal, such that proposed destructive uses elicited lots of negative arousal, and non-destructive uses did not. And we also found a mediation such that the influence of destructive uses on increased donations, so they did increase donations, was mediated by subject to negative arousal. We also measured positive arousal, and we did not find a mediating effect for that. So we were able to replicate this pattern of behavioral results in our neuroimaging sample. So we did the same task, the same ratings afterwards in the neuroimaging sample, and found the same very powerful effect of destructive use on negative arousal, which increased giving. And you can see here that destructive uses were the most effective in eliciting this negative arousal. And then there's another significant mediation of the effect of destructive uses on increasing donation through negative arousal. So what did we see in the brain? Now, I should maybe pause at this point to provide a little additional context. Usually what we've seen when people are shopping, or when they're gambling, or even when they're investing, is that we get the biggest predictive boost from positive arousal, that is excitement. So when people are regarding a proposition, we've often found that self-reported positive arousal and nucleus accumbens activation will predict that they'll go for the proposition. Here, this looks quite different to us, okay? We're not seeing a prominent role of positive arousal, we're seeing a fairly prominent role of negative arousal. So this leads us to make a different sort of a hypothesis, which is that maybe the nucleus accumbens activation is not playing so critical a role, and maybe it's another type of activation like in the anterior insula. Yeah, sorry.
Just regarding the study itself.
Yeah.
I mean the behavioral test.
Yes.
I was a little confused. You mentioned that you don't deceive the subject, so you're telling them that these are just hypothetical threats, right?
Yes.
You're telling them Yosemite Park isn't really under threat by mining, but just pretend that it's under threat by mining. Right?
Well, what we told them is some of these threats may be real, but most of them are not. And we also told them that two of their choices would be randomly one of their choices would be randomly selected to count for real, and if it did, then we would send their money that they donated either to their choice of the National or State Park Service.
Right.
Yeah, and for example, like for Yosemite At the time, there was a big push for mining within 10 miles of the park that would impact the water supply.
So yeah, we weren't blind.
It wasn't
some of the
propositions
propositions
of the
were
park
true,
and stuff. But so we gave them a few examples before we started of things that were actually happening, and said some might be hypothetical.
But you're absolutely right that most of them were hypothetical.
Also, the whatever money they donated went to their choice of California State Parks or National Parks Foundation, so they knew, that was going through, and that was going to be incentive compatible. So.
Yeah, that's how we tried to make it incentive compatible, essentially. And they did, people did donate, and we did send their money. Yeah. You did.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I hope that. But we can return to that afterwards if you like. But yeah, we were trying to sort of counterbalance things. So obviously there are some combinations that didn't occur. What do we see in the brain when people are considering these different propositions? So when people saw iconic versus non-iconic places, we did see a slight activation, I'm pointing to it, in the nucleus accumbens. But it really was not quite as prominent as the activation that we saw in the insula when people were considering destructive versus non-destructive uses. There we saw quite a difference between destructive and non-destructive uses in this insular activation. So that seemed more prominent. We also saw some interesting medial-prefrontal activation, which was basically an interaction of iconic place and destructive use. And so that's sort of consistent with what we thought. But it gets more interesting because you'll see when it's an interesting question whether it should predict that you're going to keep the money for yourself or give the money to offset the destructive use. And I didn't really, to be honest, have a prediction about that. So these are the logistic regressions on choice, both sort of psychological variables, if you were, things that we manipulated, and that's also brain activation of those three areas I mentioned before, and then the combination of the two. And essentially what we saw is that, indeed, these behaved the way that we thought they would. So iconic parks tended to increase the choice to donate. Destructive land uses also whoppingly tended to increase the choice to donate. And increased requests for donation amount decreased donations. And so this is sort of economically rational for people not to donate as much when they're asked for more money, suggesting some self-interest. What we found when we looked at the brain activity was the nucleus accumbens activation did not predict choices to donate, but anterior insula activation did. And interestingly, medial prefrontal activity negatively predicted the choice to donate. So in other words, it predicted the choice to reserve the money for yourself. When you put all of these together in the same, again, this is a very stringent test, into the same regression, the only brain area left standing is the medial prefrontal cortex. But this did sort of fit the pattern that we thought we might expect if people were responding to the destructive use, and it appears that they were more so than to the iconicness of the place. We saw something else too. I forgot to mention that we took some individual difference measures. So one of the individual difference measures we took was called the New Environmental Paradigm, NEP, measure of pro-environmental attitudes. I hope I have that right.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a measure of sort of engagement with environmental causes and so forth, and a willingness to support the environment, to preserve the environment. And so indeed what you see in this correlation is that those with higher scores on this pro-environmental attitudinal scale also were likely to give more to offset the uses overall. What we also saw in these particular subjects is that they had, it's hard to see here, but they had greater anterior insula activity when faced with destructive uses. So this is sort of consistent on an individual difference level with the within subject predictions about choice that I showed you earlier. So what do we find in summary? We found that we think affect influences choice, even in an environmental realm, but in this particular situation or this scenario, more for negative uses than for positive responses to places. The negative affective responses predicted choice, and indeed the brain activation also predicted choice. So the anterior insula activation tended to promote more donations, which is not a pattern that we have seen before in any other sort of choice scenario. Whereas the medial prefrontal activation tended to produce to predict fewer donations. Additionally, individual differences in brain activation were related to choice, such that pro-environmental, subjects who endorsed pro-environmental attitudes tend to have increased anterior insular responses to destructive uses. And I think I should let you step to the podium and wrap it up. So I've blattered on a long time.
Yeah, so just to kind of talk through what this means for pro-environmental behavior, right? And how people are engaging with this stuff. So looking at contingent valuation studies, it does seem like people are queuing to land uses when they come up with these willingness to pay measures. One thing that we hadn't mentioned explicitly, we were really hoping to find some kind of value signal for the natural resource itself, so that we could use this as, say, a complement to the survey methods that the environmental economists were using, and be able to say, look, if you use this, you're able to see, regardless of whether somebody's giving a protest here or not, relatively how much do they value these different natural resources. And that could have been found in either the MPFC or nucleus accumbens, but we didn't see that. Instead, it was much more strongly represented on the land use. Now, that might mean that we just need to design the experiment a bit differently to get out those value signals to form a complement, or that people really just don't think about valuing the environment. It's much more punitive reaction. Something that we really want to aim for is trying to use this to predict group level behavior, population level behavior. So in the last few years, there's been successful strides towards using brain imaging to outperform people's individual ratings, their conscious ratings, at predicting population level behavior. So everything from music sales to the efficacy of anti-smoking ad campaigns to whether or not a microloan funding venture gets funded. And so what we want to do with this current study is actually we're going to be working with the Nature Conservancy and trying to successfully predict using a small neural focus group whether or not people will actually successfully fund a certain conservation effort, and then look at how much does affect drive that funding, and does it actually maybe promote funding for areas for species that may not really need that funding as much. Is the money going in a needs-based way to the biggest environmental issues? Some other work that we're going to be doing in the near future is we've done a lot of work with energy efficiency and behavioral nudges. So how are people actually assessing making consumer decisions with energy efficient products? This came about because there was some work by an energy economist at Stanford, Sebastian Hood, where he was looking at real world market data of when people were buying fridges and looking at kind of how did they react to the Energy Star label. It's a certification program. You've probably seen those blue squares on a lot of items that you own. And this is supposed to denote energy efficiency in these items. The catch is that it's a fairly low bar for the energy efficiency of the product, and so there's a very wide range of products that encompasses in terms of their varying energy efficiency. And what he found was it looked like in about 25% of the population, they were making a binary decision when it came to energy efficiency on whether or not the Energy Star label was there. So there was a sufficient potential for a lot of people to actually be underinvesting in energy efficiency than if that label was removed. So we did a 1,550 person nationwide survey of homeowners and broke down all these different individual differences on how steeply they discounted the value of money through time and personality variables, how good they were at math, all these things, and had to make choices about which items would they prefer given a whole range of product attributes, which included the energy consumption and the label presence and that sort of thing. And then even did this in the magnet where people were actually buying CFL bulbs in the scanner, right? And so we found a lot of similar stuff so far. Nucleus accumbens predicting purchases. It's called part of it's part of the brain's reward pathway because of this positive arousal that Brian was talking about. And so that not only predicts purchasing behavior of these energy efficient goods, it increases more when people see something like the Energy Star. And it's in a comparable way to when they see low prices, right? So a lot of different things. We can open it up to Q&A. I can talk more about those studies, but then we broke it down on individual differences and how those played out in the brain, since this study showed that we can actually look at things like pro-environmental attitudes and see significant differences in brain activation that have an impact on behavior.
So we want to thank Precourt Energy Efficiency Center for funding this research, and the National Science Foundation actually helped us too. And you for your attention, hopefully your questions. We're really excited to hear your criticisms and suggestions. We have a lot of work to do. This is sort of a beginning for us. And so we're very happy to be here at such an interdisciplinary program. Thanks for your attention.